The stack of silver on the table stood taller than Benjamin Fletcher's clenched fist, and beside it lay a folded parchment sealed in dark orc blood wax, its edges soft with age. That parchment was worth more than every coin in the room combined. It was the last charter standing between the Bloodhorn clan and a winter of empty larders. "Call it or fold, human," Dura Bloodhorn said, and the torchlight caught the ivory curve of her tusks as she said it, her amber eyes steady across the scarred wood of the table. The crooked lantern had gone quiet in the way a room goes quiet right before something breaks. Rain hammered the shutters outside, running in black rivers down the crossroads mud of Grayford Crossing, and inside, 40 men and women who had been jeering at the Orc Duchess only minutes before now held their breath, waiting to see her lose everything in front of them. She sat with her spine straight as a plumb line, a hand of cards fanned loosely in fingers thick enough to snap a man's wrist without trying. She wore fitted black leather that laced tight up the front of her bodice, studded along the seams with dull iron rivets that caught the firelight, and a heavy traveling cloak thrown back from broad shoulders and clasped at her throat with a bronze horn. Her green-gray skin gleamed faintly with sweat in the heat of the hearth, and there was nothing about her that looked like a woman who could lose, except her eyes. Benjamin had spent 11 years running his palms over rough-cut lumber, learning to feel the hidden grain before the saw ever touched it, learning which knots would split true and which would betray a whole beam later in a storm when it mattered most. He had gotten good over those years at reading what things tried to hide. And Dura Bloodhorn's hand was hiding nothing at all. "She's got air in that hand," muttered someone behind him, and someone else laughed, ugly and quick, the way men laughed when they thought a monster was finally about to be humbled. Benjamin sat 2 chairs down from the dealer, a narrow, sharp-faced man named Sallow Grix who worked the cards for Reeve Cormac Voss and took his cut of every game that ran through the lantern. Benjamin hadn't meant to be at this table at all. He'd come in soaked to the bone with 4 silver marks in his pocket, all he had left after Voss's collectors had taken the rest as a road tax on the cart wheels he'd hauled in from the mill, and he'd sat down meaning to win back enough to fix his workshop roof before the rains got worse. He had not meant to end up staring across green knuckles and a fortune in orc silver at a woman built like a landslide. "I'll see it," he heard himself say. The whole room turned toward him like he'd struck the table with an axe. Sallow Grix's mouth twitched. "You don't have coin enough to see that pot, carpenter." "I've got my cart and my tools, and that's worth more than air," Benjamin said, and he set his 4 silver marks down slow, and then, because his hands were already moving before his good sense could catch up to them, he unhooked the leather strap of his tool roll from his belt and laid the whole bundle on the table. Chisels his father had left him. A plane he'd made himself at 17. Everything he owned that could still be called a trade. Dura Bloodhorn looked at the tool roll, then at him, and something moved behind her eyes that was not quite amusement and not quite respect, but close kin to both. "That is a poor wager for a poor hand, little man." "Maybe," Benjamin said. "But I've watched you play 3 hands tonight and you've never once looked at your cards after the first look. You look at him instead." He nodded at Sallow Grix. "You're not bluffing me. You're bluffing him, and he's too greedy to notice he's the one you're really playing." The room made a sound like a held breath finally letting go. Dura's jaw tightened, tusks flashing, and for one heartbeat Benjamin thought he had misjudged everything, that she would simply reach across the table and break something of his, starting with his neck. Instead she laughed, low and rough, a sound that rolled through the tavern like a cart over cobbles. "Show them then," she said, "since you are so clever." Sallow Grix's smile had gone thin and strange. He reached to sweep the cards together before the reveal, the way a dealer sometimes did to tidy the table, and Benjamin's carpenter's eye, the same eye that could spot a hairline crack in a beam from across a barn, caught the flash of a thumbnail scoring a mark along the edge of the King of Spears as it passed. "Don't touch those," Benjamin said, and grabbed the dealer's wrist. For one terrible second nothing happened at all. Then Dura Bloodhorn reached across the table with a speed that should not have belonged to something so large, closed 2 fingers around Sallow Grix's collar, and hauled him half over the board so the whole room could see the deck spill from his sleeve, a second deck, cards nicked along their edges in a pattern only a dealer's thumb would know to read. The tavern erupted. Chairs scraped back. Someone shouted for the Reeves men. Sallow Grix's face had gone the color of old tallow. "He's been running a false deck all night," Benjamin said, loud enough to carry over the noise, his heart slamming against his ribs so hard he thought the whole room must hear it. "Every hand. That's why she never needed to bluff you, she needed to bluff him, because the deck was already stacked against her before she ever sat down." Dura released the dealer, who folded to the floorboards in a heap, and she looked at Benjamin Fletcher with an expression he would spend the rest of his life trying to describe and never quite manage. Not gratitude, exactly. Not yet. Something sharper. Something like a woman noticing, for the first time in a long while, that the world still held a surprise or two worth having. "You could have let me lose," she said, quiet enough that only he could hear it under the din. "I could have," he agreed. Didn't feel like standing by while a rigged table robbed a woman blind, even a woman who could probably break me in half. Her mouth curved, just slightly, around one long tusk. "Probably," she agreed, and something in the way she said it made his stomach drop pleasantly, the way it did sometimes when he misjudged a step on a ladder, and the fall turned out shorter than his fear promised. That was the moment Reeve Cormac Voss's men came through the door with their hands on their sword hilts, and the moment everything in Grayford Crossing began, very quickly, to fall apart. The Reeves men were 4 in number, wearing the gray and rust colors of Voss's household, and their captain, a barrel-chested man named Hask, took one look at Sallow Grix crumpled on the floor, and the false deck scattered across the boards, and understood at once what had happened to his employer's little arrangement. "Take the deck," Hask said. "Take the pot, and take the woman." "The pot's hers by right," Benjamin said, standing before he decided to, his 4 silver marks and his tool roll forgotten entirely now that something larger than money had planted itself between him and sitting still. "She won it fair once the cheat was shown." Hask looked at him the way a man looks at a dog that has, against all expectation, decided to bite. "And who in the hells are you?" "Benjamin Fletcher," he said. "Millwright. I built half the cart axles and half the barn frames from here to the Ridge Road, and I've got no quarrel with the reeve, but I've got eyes, and I saw a cheat's deck same as everyone else in this room." "This is a matter for the Bloodhorn clan and the Reeves court," Hask said. "Not a carpenter's business." "It became a carpenter's business," Dura said, rising to her full height, which put her head near the low rafters and put a good foot of difference between her eyes and Hask's. "The moment your Reeves cheat tried to rob me at his table. Tell Voss his deck is exposed before the whole of Grayford Crossing, and tell him the Bloodhorn charter stays where it is until the Crown's magistrate rides through and settles the matter proper, as law allows." It was a bluff of a different kind now, and Benjamin understood it even as she spoke it. There was no magistrate scheduled to ride through Grayford Crossing for another 2 months at least, and Voss's word carried more weight than any distant Crown officials in a crossroads town this far from anywhere that mattered. But she said it with such flat, unshakable certainty that Hask hesitated, glancing at his men, glancing at the crowd of witnesses who would carry this tale to every hearth in town by morning regardless of what he did next. "This isn't finished," Hask said, and swept Sallow Grix up by the collar and out the door into the rain, his men following, throwing looks back at Benjamin that promised a longer conversation later. The tavern exhaled all at once. Somebody laughed nervously. The tavern keeper, a wiry, gray-braided woman named Tamsin Hollies, came around the bar with a rag twisted in her hands and looked at the mess on her floor with something between exasperation and awe. "Well," she said, "that's the most excitement this floor's seen since the flood of '41. Dura Bloodhorn gathered her winnings, the silver and the parchment both, with unhurried care, and then she looked down at Benjamin's tool roll still lying on the table and picked it up too, holding it out to him. "You wagered a craftsman's whole trade on a stranger's hand of cards," she said. "That is either very stupid or very brave, and I have not yet decided which. Ask me again once your reeve stops wanting to hang me from the mill wheel," Benjamin said, and found, to his own surprise, that he was grinning at her. The same easy, crooked grin he gave a stubborn plank when it finally fit the joint after the third try. The grin of a man who had just done something reckless and was not yet sorry for it. Dura Bloodhorn looked at that grin the way a woman looks at a coin she suspects might be worth more than its weight, and something in her chest, long guarded, shifted a half a degree toward a place she had not let it go in a very long time. "Walk with me, carpenter," she said. "Before the Reeves men decide to finish tonight's business in an alley instead of a courtroom." He walked with her out into the rain, and neither of them looked back at the tavern, though half the room watched them go. The road out of Grayford Crossing ran along the river, mud sucking at their boots, torchlight from the tavern windows falling away behind them, until there was only the wet dark and the sound of water. Dura Bloodhorn walked like a woman who had never once worried about where the ground was going to be under her next step, and Benjamin found himself matching her stride out of something like instinct, though her legs were half again as long as his. "You should know what you did tonight," she said finally. "Voss will not forgive being made a fool before half the town. He does not forgive small things. He will not forgive this." "I've lived under his tax collectors long enough to know that," Benjamin said. "He took near everything I earned off that cart of lumber last month, called it a road toll. There's no road toll on record anywhere but in his own ledger." "He does the same to my people," Dura said, and for the first time her voice lost some of its iron, roughened by something older and more tired. "My father signed a charter 20 years past, granting the Bloodhorn clan free passage through this crossing in trade for peace along the Ridge Road. Voss has spent 3 years finding ways to make that charter worthless tolls his own charter forbids, fines invented from nothing, debts he claims my father owed and never paid. Tonight I came to win back proof, in coin and testimony both, that the charter still stands as written. I did not expect a human millwright to hand it to me instead." "I didn't hand you anything," Benjamin said. "I just couldn't sit still and watch a cheat." "That," Dura said, glancing sideways at him with an expression he was starting to recognize as her particular flavor of amusement, "is precisely the sort of thing that gets a man killed in this crossing. Or," she added, after a pause just long enough to feel deliberate, "kept." Benjamin Fletcher, who had lived alone in a workshop at the edge of Grayford Crossing for 6 years, who ate most of his suppers standing at his own bench because there was no one waiting at a table for him, felt that word land somewhere under his ribs and stay there, warm, long after they had parted ways in the rain. He did not sleep well that night, though not from fear of Voss. Grayford Crossing sat where the Ridge Road met the River Road, a huddle of stone-footed timber buildings strung along mud streets that turned to soup every autumn, its torches burning at every corner, because the crossroads never fully slept. Wagons came through at all hours, trading iron and grain and hides, and Reeve Cormac Voss had made himself the toll and tax on every one of them. He had come to the crossing 8 years past as a minor crown official, and through a slow accumulation of fines, forged debts, and a private army of hired swords dressed up as lawful wardens, he had made himself something closer to a warlord than a magistrate bleeding coin from human farmer and orc clan alike, and using the Crooked Lantern's card tables, rigged by men like sallow gricks, to finish off anyone who still had a little left after his tax collectors were done. Benjamin Fletcher built things. He had built the mill wheel that ground the crossing's grain, built half the wagon beds that hauled goods along the Ridge Road, built the very bar that Tamsin Hollies poured drinks across. He built things meant to last, joints fitted so tight a man could set his whole weight on them and trust the wood to hold. He had never much wanted for anything beyond good timber, a sharp blade, and quiet evenings, until the night an Orc Duchess sat down across a rigged table and made him remember what it felt like to want something else entirely. Dura Bloodhorn ruled, or tried to rule, under increasingly desperate circumstances over the Bloodhorn clan of Ashridge Vale, a hard, high valley 2 days' ride past the ridge road where her people raised goats and mined a thin seam of iron and depended, every autumn, on trading both through Grayford Crossing before the mountain passes closed. Her father had died 4 winters past, leaving her the Vale, the clan, and the charter that Voss had spent every year since chipping away at like a man sanding down a beam, meant to hold a roof. She had come to the crossing this particular week not for trade, but because Voss had sent word that unless the clan paid a compliance fine, equal to nearly a season's worth of iron, he would declare the charter void for breach and close the crossing to Bloodhorn traders entirely. A sentence of slow starvation for a clan that could not feed itself without trade. She had gone to the card table because she had nothing else left to try. She had gone in knowing the deck was likely crooked and gone in anyway, because sometimes the only weapon a duchess with an empty treasury had left was her own nerve. Benjamin found her 3 days later exactly where he expected her to be, sitting on an overturned crate outside his workshop at the edge of town, in the last gray light before full dark, watching him work through the open doorway with an expression of open, unhurried curiosity. "You've been sitting there an hour," he said, setting down his plane. "I like watching a man who knows what he's doing with his hands," Dura said, and there was nothing subtle about the way she said it, no attempt to soften the edge of it into something more polite. She wore the same fitted leathers she'd worn at the card table, laced tight, road dust ground into the seams now, her cloak folded over one knee. It is a rare thing to watch. Most men fumble. Benjamin felt his ears go warm despite the evening chill. Most men didn't have a father who beat carpentry into them before they were tall enough to reach the bench. "Mine beat sword work into me the same way," Dura said. "I do not know which of us had the worse childhood for it." "Coming out of the damp," he said, "before the Reeves men decide loitering near a millwright's shop is grounds for another fine." She laughed at that, and followed him inside, and the workshop, which had held nothing but Benjamin and sawdust, and the smell of raw pine for 6 years, suddenly felt smaller and warmer and entirely different with an Orc Duchess filling half of it. They talked while he worked, or rather, he worked and she talked, asking him questions about joinery with a genuine, unhidden curiosity that surprised him, turning a half-finished chair leg over in fingers that could have snapped it like a twig and didn't, tracing the grain the way he might. "Voss will not let this go," she said eventually, setting the chair leg down. "Hask has already been asking after you at the tavern, asking which farms buy your work, asking where you sleep." "I sleep here," Benjamin said, "same as always." "Then you should not," Dura said, flat and certain. "Sleep here tonight." He looked up from the bench. "You planning on making that an order, your grace?" Something flickered across her face at the title, half wry, half something rower. "I have very little left to give orders over. My clan's treasury is empty. My charter is worth exactly as much as Voss decides to honor, which is nothing. I have 4 guardsmen left who have not deserted for lack of pay, and one of them is 70 years old and mostly deaf. So no, Carpenter, I am not ordering you, I am asking. Come somewhere safer than a workshop with one door and no way to see who is coming." "You could come with me to Tobias's forge," Benjamin said slowly. "He's an old friend, owes me for 3 cart axles. He'll not ask questions." "I would rather," Dura said, standing, close enough now that Benjamin had to tip his head back to hold her eyes, close enough that he could smell rain and leather and something warmer underneath it, "that you came with me." It was not, in the end, a very difficult decision. They did not go far, only to the old mill house on the river's bend, half a mile past the last house in Grayford Crossing, where Benjamin had spent 2 summers rebuilding the wheel and knew every board and beam by feel even in the dark. It was safer than his workshop, further from Voss's usual patrols, and it had the advantage, Dura pointed out with a directness that made his chest go tight of having only one bed. "I'll take the floor," Benjamin said immediately. "You will not," Dura said. "A man your size on that floor will wake with a back like a bent nail, and I need you standing, not hobbling, if Voss's men come calling." She said it practically like a duchess assessing a supply line, but there was a warmth underneath the practicality that neither of them missed. "The bed is wide enough. I do not bite carpenter, not unless asked." He did not sleep on the floor that night, though he did not, that first night, sleep much closer to her than the far edge of the same wide mattress, both of them too aware of each other to pretend otherwise, both too stubborn to say so aloud. Somewhere past midnight her hand found his in the dark, only that, fingers curling loosely around his calloused palm, and he lay there listening to the river outside, and thought that he had not, in 6 long years alone in Grayford Crossing, ever felt less lonely than he did in that moment, hand in hand with a woman who could have crushed his fingers to splinters and chose, instead, to hold them like something worth keeping. Voss's men found the mill house 4 days later. Benjamin had gone into town that morning for nails and word of the reeve's mood, and came back along the river path to find Hask and 6 armed men already at the mill, and Dura standing in the doorway with her arms crossed, refusing to move, while Hask read aloud from a warrant that named her a fugitive from crown taxation, and Benjamin an accomplice in theft and assault upon a reeve's dealer. "That's a lie built from nothing," Benjamin shouted, breaking into a run the last stretch of path, mud sucking at his boots. "Sallow Grix cheated her fair and square, half the tavern saw it." "The tavern's memory has been improved with coin," Hask said, not unkindly, the way a man might explain rain to someone who'd already gotten wet. "Voss says the Duchess owes him for the pot she stole and the dealer's humiliation both, and he says you're to be brought in for questioning regardless. Best you both come quiet." "Best you tell your reeve," Dura said, "that I did not survive 4 winters holding a starving clan together to be taken quiet by 7 men, and a warrant written in another man's hand." What happened next happened fast enough that Benjamin, telling it later, could never quite put the pieces in the right order. One of Hask's men lunged for Dura's wrist. She caught his arm and threw him bodily into the millpond with a splash that soaked 3 of his fellows. Hask drew his sword, and Benjamin, without any plan beyond not letting that sword find her, grabbed the nearest thing to hand, an axe handle leaning by the door, unfinished, no head on it yet, and swung it hard enough into Hask's sword arm to send the blade spinning into the grass. For a moment everyone simply stood there, stunned by the sheer noise of it all, and then Dura grabbed Benjamin's hand and they ran, splashing through the shallows below the mill wheel, up the far bank, into the tree line, leaving Hask's men cursing and dripping behind them. They ran until the shouting faded, until the trees thickened into proper forest along the base of the ridge, and only then did Dura slow, breathing hard, and rather than release his hand she pulled him around to face her, backed him gently against the trunk of an old oak, and kissed him. It was not a soft kiss, not tentative. It was the kiss of a woman who had decided something, and did not intend to wait politely for the world's permission to act on it, one hand fisted in the front of his shirt, the other cupping the back of his skull like she meant to keep him exactly where he was for as long as it suited her. Benjamin, who had spent years learning patience with wood that never once kissed back, found he did not need a moment to decide what to do with his hands, sliding one to the small of her back, the leather warm under his palm, and kissing her the way he'd wanted to since the moment she'd laughed at a rigged card table 3 days past. When they finally broke apart, both of them breathing unevenly, rain beginning to patter through the canopy above, Dura pressed her forehead briefly to his and said, low and rough, "I have wanted to do that since you called my bluff and did not flinch." "I've wanted you to do that since you told me you don't bite unless asked," Benjamin said, and felt her laugh against his mouth before she kissed him again. They did not go back to the mill house. They spent that night in a hunter's blind Benjamin had built years ago on a ridge overlooking the river road, a small enclosed platform meant for watching deer trails, barely big enough for two, and neither of them minded the closeness one bit. Somewhere in the dark, tangled together under his spare cloak with the rain drumming steady overhead, Dura told him about her father, about the Vale, about the clan's shrinking herds and the winter 3 years back that had nearly broken them. And Benjamin told her about his own father, dead of a fever when Benjamin was 19, about the 6 lonely years of building things for other people's homes, and never quite building one of his own worth living in. "You should build one now," Dura said against his shoulder, half asleep. "Something worth living in." "I've an idea what I might build it for," Benjamin said, and felt her smile against his skin even in the dark. They spent the better part of 2 weeks like fugitives and lovers both at once, moving between the forest blind and Tobias Reed's forge on nights they dared risk the town, gathering what they could find of Voss's crimes. Tobias, a broad, soot-stained blacksmith who had known Benjamin since boyhood, turned out to keep meticulous mental tally of every fine Voss's men had ever levied against his forge, and pointed them toward a widow at the edge of town, Ada Pell, who had once worked as Voss's household clerk before he dismissed her for asking too many questions about his ledgers. Ada Pell, it turned out, still had a copy of an old tax ledger she'd smuggled out the day Voss let her go, a ledger that recorded, in Voss's own cramped hand, tolls collected under charters that had explicitly forbidden them, including 3 years of illegal fines against the Bloodhorn clan alone. "This is enough to hang him," Dura said, turning the pages by candlelight in Tobias's back room, her voice tight with something between fury and disbelief. "If a crown magistrate ever saw this." "The nearest magistrate's 2 months out," Tobias said grimly. "Voss knows it same as we do. He's not worried about the crown. He's worried about the town believing this before he can silence everyone who's seen it." It was Ada Pell, small and gray and still bitter about her dismissal, who told them the thing that changed the shape of everything. Voss's caravan of collected tax coin, a season's worth from 3 settlements including the Bloodhorn tribute, was due to be loaded onto a river barge and shipped downriver to the Crown's regional treasury in 11 days' time, escorted by Hask and a dozen men. Once that coin left Grayford Crossing, the evidence of exactly how much Voss had skimmed for himself along the way, the difference between what the ledger said he'd collected and what the Crown actually received, would be gone forever, and with it any hope of proving, cleanly and publicly, that he was a thief rather than merely an unpopular tax collector. "Then we don't let it leave quiet," Benjamin said. "We make Voss answer for it here in front of the whole crossing before that barge ever touches the water." Dura looked at him for a long moment, something fierce and warm moving behind her eyes. "You have gone from a man who calls bluffs at cards to a man who plans to bring down a reeve in 11 days. I did not expect that particular sort of carpenter when I sat down at that table." "Neither did I," Benjamin admitted, and grinned at her, and she leaned across the table and kissed him hard enough to knock the candle sideways, laughing against his mouth when Tobias groaned and covered his eyes. The chance to test their nerve, and to change, for one blinding afternoon, everything the town of Grayford Crossing believed about Dura Bloodhorn came sooner than any of them planned, and came from an accident rather than a plot. 3 days before the barge was due to leave, Voss's men, still smarting over the humiliation at the mill house, decided to make an example of Benjamin's workshop while he was known to be elsewhere, dragging a hired ox cart loaded with confiscated timber and tools out of it in broad daylight, meaning to auction his livelihood off in the market square as punishment for a millwright who dared raise a hand against a reeve's warden. A crowd had gathered, drawn by the spectacle, some jeering along with Voss's men, some uneasy but silent, when the overloaded cart's rear axle, stacked far past its honest weight with green timber Benjamin himself had cut and dried and would never have loaded so carelessly, gave way with a crack like a rifle shot. The cart's bed tipped, timber cascading, and a boy no older than 10, who had darted too close chasing a rolling barrel hoop, went down beneath the collapsing edge of the cart bed itself, pinned at the shoulder under a weight that made grown men in the crowd cry out and freeze rather than move. Dura Bloodhorn had come into the square that very moment searching for Benjamin, and she did not freeze. She crossed the mud at a dead run, shouldered aside two of Voss's own guards without slowing, and drove both hands beneath the edge of the tipped cart bed, timber and iron-shod wheel and all, a weight that would have taken 4 strong men and a lever to shift under ordinary circumstances, and hauled it upward with a roar that seemed to come from somewhere older than her own throat, muscles standing out along her arms like cords of rope pulled to breaking. Boots sinking to the ankle in mud from the sheer force she drove into the ground. For one endless heartbeat the whole square went utterly silent. The jeering crowd, the guards, even the boy's own mother froze in mid-scream, as the cart bed rose, impossibly, a foot clear of the ground, held aloft on the strength of one woman's arms alone. "Pull him free," Dura ground out through clenched teeth, and someone finally moved, a farmer diving forward to drag the boy out from under the tilted bed by his ankles, and only when he was clear did Dura let the whole ruined cart crash back down into the mud, staggering back a step, chest heaving, mud and splinters clinging to leather that had gone from proud to filthy in the space of 10 seconds. No one in that square jeered again. The boy's mother was on her knees in the mud a moment later, sobbing her thanks against Dura's forearm, and the crowd that had been calling her monster not 5 minutes before now stood in a silence thick enough to touch, staring at her the way people stare at weather, at something too large and too real to argue with. Benjamin arrived at a dead sprint moments later, having heard the crash of the axle from 2 streets away, and shoved through the crowd to find Dura standing exactly where the cart had fallen, breathing hard, her hands trembling faintly now that the moment had passed, and something raw and frightened in her eyes that had nothing to do with her own strength, and everything to do with how close that boy had come to dying under Wood Voss's greed had loaded too heavy. "You could have been crushed," Benjamin said, reaching her, hands finding her face, her shoulders, checking for injury with a frantic thoroughness that made her laugh weakly despite everything. "I have carried heavier," she said. "Though not," she admitted, quieter, often at that speed and never for a stranger's child. "You didn't hesitate," he said, "not for a second. Neither did you at that card table," she said, "for a stranger's fortune." Her hand found his, mud and all, and held on. "Perhaps we are neither of us built for hesitation, Carpenter." The crowd around them, still hushed, began to murmur not jeers now but something closer to wonder, and a few voices, hesitant, offered thanks of their own. It was not friendship, not yet, not from a whole town that had spent years fearing and mocking every orc who passed through the crossing, but it was the first crack of daylight through a door that had been shut a very long time, and Benjamin felt Dura's hand tighten around his as she recognized it too. Voss's guards, who had watched the whole spectacle from the edge of the square without lifting a finger to help the boy, retreated without a word, and word of what had happened, the strength of it, the mercy of it, the guards' cowardice beside it, spread through Greyford Crossing faster than any rumor Voss himself could ever hope to plant. That night back at the forest blind, with a fire burning low and Dura's hand still faintly trembling as Benjamin cleaned a splinter wound from her palm by firelight, she said, quiet, "They have called me monster since I was old enough to understand the word. My own strength has always been the thing that frightens them first, before anything else about me. I did not think today would change that. I still do not think it has changed all of it." "It changed something," Benjamin said, pressing a careful kiss to her palm once the splinter was out. "I watched it change. A woman held a wagon off a child with her bare hands and didn't wait to be thanked before she did it. That's not the kind of thing people forget quick, whatever else they believe about orcs. You did not flinch from my strength either," Dura said. "Not at the cart, not before. Most men, even the ones who claim to want me smaller in their minds than I am. You have never once asked me to be smaller." "Why would I want you smaller," Benjamin said, "when everything about you as you are is the finest thing that's ever walked into my life?" She kissed him then, slow and searching, and when she pulled him down beside the fire that night there was nothing hesitant left between them. Only the long, unhurried unraveling of two people who had each spent years bracing against a loneliness they had stopped expecting anyone to reach past, finding, at last, in each other, exactly the kind of shelter neither of them had known they were still allowed to want. Outside, the rain had finally stopped, and the fire burned low and steady, and Benjamin Fletcher, who had built so many things meant to last for other people, understood for the first time what it might feel like to be one of the things worth building a life around instead. They had 8 days left before the barge, and Voss, humiliated twice now before his own crossing, did not intend to let a third humiliation happen quietly. He struck 4 days later, and struck at the one place he guessed correctly they would eventually have to return, Tobias Reed's forge, where Ada Pell's ledger was hidden beneath a loose hearthstone. Hask and 8 men surrounded the forge at dusk, torches lit, and this time there was no crowd to soften Voss's hand, only Tobias, Ada, Benjamin, and Dura caught inside with one door and a wall of angry iron between them and the road. "Send out the ledger and the 2 of you," Hask called through the door, "and the smith and the widow walk free. Voss doesn't want them. He wants what you stole, and he wants the man who broke my sword arm." "The ledger's Voss's own crimes in his own hand," Dura called back. "You'd have your men burn a smithy to bury the truth of what he's done to this crossing." "I'd have my men do a great many things I don't love, for the pay Voss offers and the family I've got to feed," Hask answered, and there was something tired in it that told Benjamin the captain took no joy in this particular errand. It was Dura, in the end, who made the choice that turned hunted into hunter for the first time since the mill house. She would not have Tobias's forge burned for their sake, would not have Ada Pell's small, brave defiance cost the old widow her life, and so she stepped out the forge door alone, hands open and empty, into the ring of torchlight and drawn swords, and Benjamin's heart nearly stopped in his chest watching her do it. "You want to fight, Captain," she said, loud enough for every man in that ring to hear. "Then fight me alone, honest, before your men, instead of burning a smith's forge around 2 old friends who have done nothing but tell the truth." Hask hesitated. Whatever else he was not, it seemed, entirely without honor, and the offer of a clean fight against dragging an old woman from a burning building sat visibly better with him. "Single combat," Hask said slowly. "You win, we withdraw, and I carry word to Voss that this ends here. I win, you come in without more blood spilled tonight." "Agreed," Dura said before Benjamin could shout the objection climbing his throat. What followed was not a long fight. Hask was strong and trained and knew how to use a sword, but he had never in his life faced an Orc Duchess, who had spent every winter of her adult life keeping raiders and wolves both from her clan's herds with nothing but her own 2 hands, and whatever weapon happened to be closest. She took his first strike on a forearm that did not so much as bleed through the leather, closed the distance before he could recover his guard, and put him flat on his back in the mud with a throw that left him staring up at the stars, winded and beaten and entirely unable to rise. "Withdraw," Dura said, standing over him, not unkindly. "You've a family waiting on your pay, Captain. Don't let Voss spend your life on his greed." Hask, to his credit, called his men back without argument, and the ring of torches retreated down the road, leaving the forge standing, the ledger safe, and Dura Bloodhorn breathing hard but whole in the dark, Benjamin already at her side with hands roaming her arms and shoulders checking again, for wounds she insisted, laughing, that she did not have. "You cannot keep doing that," Benjamin said, half furious, half undone with relief. "Walking out alone like that. My heart cannot survive many more of your bargains, Dura." "Then you had best get used to it," Dura said, catching his face in both hands. because I do not intend to stop being the sort of woman who walks toward danger instead of waiting for it to arrive. If you want a quiet woman, Carpenter, you have chosen very badly." "I haven't chosen badly at all," Benjamin said, and kissed her there in the mud outside the forge, both of them laughing between kisses with the particular giddy relief of two people who had just survived something and found, on the other side of it, that they still very much wanted each other. It was Ada Pell who pointed out, once they were all safely inside and the door bolted, that Hask's retreat and the story of it would travel through Grayford Crossing exactly as fast as the tail of the cart in the square had. "Voss is losing his own men's confidence," she said. "First the boy in the square, now his own captain beaten fair and sent home. He'll not survive many more public failures. He knows it too. That barge leaving in 4 days is not just tax coin to him anymore. It's his last chance to disappear the evidence before the whole crossing turns against him outright." "Then we don't let him make it to the barge," Benjamin said. "We bring the reckoning to him first in the open where the whole town can see it, same as they saw the cart, same as they saw Hask beaten fair. No hiding, no midnight raids, a public account." Dura's eyes found his, something fierce and warm and entirely certain moving through them. "A public reckoning," she agreed, "needs a stage Voss cannot refuse to stand on." "The crooked lantern," Benjamin said slowly, an idea taking shape the way a joint sometimes revealed itself under his hands before his mind had fully caught up to the design. "He built his little empire at that card table. Let's finish it there, in front of the whole town. One last hand out in the open where he can't rig a deck without every eye in the crossing watching him do it." "He will never agree to sit at a table with me again," Dura said. "Not after what happened last time." "He will," Benjamin said, "if the stakes are big enough that his greed outweighs his pride. Voss doesn't fear you, Dura. He fears losing. Offer him something he can't resist trying to take back." It took 2 more days of careful, quiet arrangement. A word passed to Tamsin Hollies, who agreed without hesitation to host the game and to have half the town conveniently present under the excuse of a harvest gathering. A promise extracted from Ada Pell to have the ledger ready to produce at exactly the right moment. A message sent to Voss himself, carried by a boy paid a silver mark, informing the reeve that the Bloodhorn Duchess wished to settle the matter of the charter once, and for all in a single wager, winner take all, before the whole crossing as witness, her clan's entire remaining treasury against the charter's full restoration, and Voss's public renouncement of every illegal fine he had ever levied. Voss agreed. Of course he agreed. A woman offering to hand him her clan's entire remaining fortune in one desperate hand was exactly the kind of greed a man like Cormac Voss could never resist, and he did not yet know that Benjamin Fletcher and a blacksmith and a dismissed clerk had spent the better part of 2 weeks assembling, quietly, everything necessary to make sure that greed cost him everything. The morning of the game dawned clear for the first time in weeks, pale sunlight slanting gold across the mud of the crossroads square, where Tamsin Hollies had a long trestle table dragged out from the lantern and set up in full view of the market stalls, exactly as Benjamin had asked. Word had spread through the whole crossing overnight. Everyone knew by now that the Orc Duchess, who had lifted a cart off a child with her bare hands, was going to sit down against Reeve Voss himself and wager everything her clan had left. By mid-morning the square was packed 3 deep with farmers and traders and off-duty guardsmen, all pressing close, all watching. Dura Bloodhorn arrived in the same fitted black leathers she had worn the night Benjamin first called her Bluff, cloak thrown back, her clan's entire remaining treasury, every coin Ashridge Vale possessed, carried in a single iron-banded chest by 2 of her 4 remaining guardsmen set beside her on the table. Voss arrived flanked by Hask, who would not quite meet Dura's eyes, and by a new dealer brought in specially from a neighboring town, a stranger to Grayford Crossing, whom Voss clearly believed no one had yet had the chance to bribe or intimidate. Benjamin stood at the edge of the crowd, close enough to see, too far by design, to be accused of interfering directly in the game itself. His part in this reckoning was not at the table. It was in his coat pocket, folded twice, Ada Pell's ledger, and beside it, a sworn statement from Hask himself, given quietly the morning after his defeat outside the forge, admitting under his own hand to 3 years of fines collected under Voss's direct order that no charter or crown law had ever authorized. Voss dealt first hand. He was good, Benjamin would give him that, watching the man's face across the crowd, utterly composed, utterly certain. 3 hands passed with modest wagers, testing, circling both players, folding early when the cards ran thin, the crowd murmuring with every raise and every fold. And then on the 4th hand, Voss pushed forward a wager equal to a full quarter of the crown's usual regional tax revenue, a staggering sum, his eyes bright with the particular hunger of a man who believed he finally smelled the kill. "Match it," he said, "or fold the charter forever, Duchess. Your clan's whole fortune against my claim on that vale. Winner takes all, as agreed." The square went utterly silent. Every eye turned to Dura, who looked down at her cards. Benjamin, watching from the crowd, could see just enough of her face to know, with the same certainty he'd felt the very first night, that her hand held nothing worth the wager Voss was demanding. It was a terrible hand. It was perhaps the worst hand a duchess could hold, with everything her people owned sitting on the table in front of her. She looked up, past Voss, across the square, and found Benjamin's eyes in the crowd. He grinned at her. It was not a grin that promised her a winning hand, because he had no idea what cards she held and could not have known even if he had wanted to cheat for her, which he did not, because cheating had never been the plan. It was simply his grin, the same crooked, easy grin she had first seen across a rigged table 3 weeks before, the grin of a man who had bet his entire trade on a stranger's honesty and never once regretted it, the grin that told her, without a single word spoken across that crowded square, that whatever happened in the next 60 seconds, he was not going anywhere, and neither was the truth he carried folded in his coat. Dura Bloodhorn looked at that grin and pushed the entire iron-banded chest of her clan's fortune into the center of the table. "Matched," she said. Voss's smile widened, triumphant, already reaching for the pot before the cards were even shown, and that was precisely the moment Benjamin Fletcher pushed through the crowd, stepped up to the table, and laid 2 folded papers down beside the chest. "Before this hand is called," Benjamin said, loud enough for the whole square to hear, "the crossing ought to see what's actually being wagered here, Reeve, because it isn't the Duchess's fortune against your claim on Ashridge Vale. It's 3 years of stolen tax against a charter you had no right to touch in the first place. This is a card game," Voss snapped, color rising in his face, "not a courtroom, Carpenter, and you have no standing at this table." "He doesn't need standing at the table," Ada Pell's voice rang out, and the small gray widow stepped from the crowd to stand beside Benjamin, her chin lifted higher than Benjamin had ever seen it. "He needs standing before this crossing, same as I do and same as your own captain does." She looked at Hask. "Tell them what you signed, Captain, or I will read it aloud myself." Hask, to the visible fury of his employer, did not hesitate long. "I signed a statement," he said, voice carrying flat and heavy across the square, "admitting that Reeve Voss ordered fines collected against the Bloodhorn clan and against half the farms on the Ridge Road that no charter or crown law ever authorized. 3 years of it. I have his own written orders to prove it, same as this ledger does." The crowd's murmur turned, in the space of a breath, into a roar, and Cormac Voss, understanding at last that the crowd around him was no longer merely spectators to a card game but witnesses to his own undoing, shoved back from the table so hard his chair toppled into the mud. "This changes nothing," he shouted, though his voice had lost its certainty. "The wager stands. The cards will decide. The cards decided nothing that mattered," Dura Bloodhorn said, rising slowly to her full height, and the crowd around her parted instinctively, remembering, perhaps, exactly what those hands were capable of when a cart had needed lifting. You built this whole crossing's fear of me and my clan on cheats and false ledgers and men too frightened of your coin to speak the truth, Voss. That ends today. Not because I won a hand of cards. Because the truth was finally strong enough to be spoken aloud, where everyone could hear it. Voss looked around the square at the crowd at Hask, at Ada Pell's steady, unblinking stare, at Benjamin Fletcher standing calm and unafraid beside a duchess, who had just wagered everything her people owned on nothing more than the certainty that a good man's grin meant the truth was already on its way, and found, for the first time in 8 years of ruling Grayford crossing through fear and false debts, that not a single person in that crowd was willing to stand at his side. He ran. He did not get far. 2 of the crossing's own farmers, men who had lost land to his invented finds, caught him before he reached the river road, and by the time the town's elected reeve warden, a position Voss himself had long ago hollowed of any real power, but which still existed in law and was quickly resurrected that same afternoon by popular demand, arrived to take custody of him. Half the crossing had gathered to watch, and not one voice was raised in his defense. He was held in the old grain store under guard until, 3 weeks later, a crown magistrate finally did ride through, drawn early by a rider Ada Pell had sent the very night of the card game, and Cormac Voss was taken east in chains to answer for 8 years of theft, his household seized, his ill-gotten coin returned in large part to the very settlements he had bled. The Bloodhorn charter was restored in full before the magistrate's own hand and seal, free passage guaranteed, every illegal fine formally struck from record, and the iron-banded chest of Ashridge Vale's fortune, every coin of it, since the wager itself had never truly been decided by cards at all, was returned to Dura Bloodhorn before the whole square, to a cheer that would have been unthinkable from that same crowd only a month before. Grayford Crossing spent that evening, the way crossroads towns spend their best evenings, with every barrel in the crooked lantern tapped dry and half the square lit by bonfires and lanterns strung between the stalls, and somewhere in the middle of all that noise and gladness, Dura Bloodhorn found Benjamin Fletcher exactly where she had first found him weeks before, quietly making himself useful. This time helping Tamsin Holly's haul benches out for the celebration instead of hiding in a workshop corner. "You are supposed to be being celebrated," she said, taking the bench from his hands and setting it down herself, not fetching furniture like a man still afraid someone will notice him. "Old habits," Benjamin admitted. "I've spent a lot of years being the sort of man nobody much noticed." "I noticed you," Dura said, "the very first night, before you ever opened your mouth. You had the look of a man who watched everything and said nothing, and I remember thinking that was either the most useless kind of man in the world or the most dangerous, and I did not yet know which. Which did I turn out to be?" "Dangerous," she said. "In the very best way a man can be dangerous to a woman's peace." She took his hand, drew him a little apart from the noise of the celebration, out to the edge of the square where the firelight thinned and the stars had come out clean and cold above the ridge. "I have something to ask you, Benjamin Fletcher, and I would ask it properly, since you have earned that much." He turned to face her fully, heart already climbing into his throat at the sudden seriousness in her voice. "Among my people," Dura said, "when a warrior chooses another to stand beside her for the whole of her life, she offers a claiming, a mark, sometimes, or a token carved by her own hand, or, among the old clans, simply this." She reached up and unclasped the bronze wolf horn clasp from her cloak, the very one she had worn the night at the card table, and pressed it into his palm, closing his fingers around it with both of her own hands. "It says, to any who see it worn, that the one who carries it belongs to Dura Bloodhorn, and that Dura Bloodhorn belongs to him in return, and neither of us intends that claim to be undone by distance, or danger, or any reeve foolish enough to try. I am not asking you to become an orc, Benjamin, nor to leave your workshop, nor to give up one single thing that makes you who you are. I am asking you to be mine openly before my clan and your crossing both, for as long as we both draw breath." Benjamin looked down at the bronze clasp in his hand, warm from her skin, and then up at her face, fierce and open, and for the first time since he had known her, entirely unguarded, and felt something in his chest that had been quietly hollow for 6 long years finally fully fill. "I built things meant to last my whole life," he said, voice rough. "Cart axles, barn frames, mill wheels. I never once thought I'd get the chance to build a life instead. Yes, Dura, I am already yours. I think I have been since the moment you laughed at that table instead of breaking my arm for calling your bluff." She kissed him then, slow and certain, in the thin firelight at the edge of a crowd too busy celebrating to notice. And when she finally drew back, she took the clasp from his hand and fastened it herself at the collar of his shirt, her thumb resting a moment against his throat as if to feel his pulse and be certain once and for all that it beat only for her. They stayed in Grayford Crossing through that autumn, Benjamin rebuilding not just his workshop but a proper house beside it, timber and stone raised with his own 2 hands, and more often than not, with the considerable help of a duchess who found genuine, unhurried pleasure in learning to plane a board true under his patient instruction. Dura split her time between the crossing and Ashridge Vale, riding the ridge road often enough that the toll gate guards, new and honest under the restored charter, learned to wave her through with a respectful nod rather than a suspicious stare. And more than once Benjamin rode with her, learning her clan's high valley the way he had once learned Grayford Crossing's crooked streets, welcomed at her hearth by a people who had watched their duchess return from the crossing not just with their charter restored, but with a quiet, steady human at her side who looked at her, always, the way a man looks at the one true thing he never thought he'd be lucky enough to find. On the first snow of that winter, with the new house finished, its joints fitted so tight not a single draft found its way through the walls, Dura Bloodhorn stood in the doorway of the home Benjamin Fletcher had built for both of them, watching the flakes fall soft and silent over the crossroads that had once feared her and now, in its slow and imperfect way, had come to call her neighbor, and felt Benjamin's arms come around her from behind, his chin resting against her shoulder. Warm and solid and entirely, wonderfully hers. "No more bluffing," she said softly, leaning back into him. "No more bluffing," he agreed. "Just this, just you and me and whatever we build next." Outside, the snow kept falling, and the crossroads lanterns burned steady against the dark. And for the first time in either of their lives, neither Dura Bloodhorn nor Benjamin Fletcher was alone in the watching of it.